Proposals for Sunday liquor sales are ready to be tapped, and the anti-bullying bill stalled in 2013. Can it gain support this year? We examine in Capitol Report. Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to this week's Capitol Report. I'm Julie Bartkey. Minnesota remains one of 12 states in the United States that currently bans Sunday liquor sales. Some of the strongest support for maintaining that ban has been within the liquor industry, particularly liquor stores. Now, the issue will likely resurface again with bills in the House and Senate ready to be uncorked. Here to discuss his bill on allowing Sunday liquor sales, we have Duluth Senator Roger Reinert. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, you're very welcome. Glad to be here.
And Senator, I pointed out the Duluth because you are a border town. Is that
Right.
one of the reasons why you're a bit more passionate about this issue?
Actually, it's not. I know it's an easy place to go for folks, but it really, to me, is just about the freedom of the marketplace. I'm a little perplexed at the need in the year 2014 for government to tell businesses when they should be open and when they should be closed. And in this situation, we clearly have consumers that want to make purchases, and we have businesses that want to be open. So, if we're all about business, especially small business, why wouldn't we just step out of this? And the fact that 2014 is an unsession, I can't think of any better year to do it.
And you bring up how government shouldn't be telling business what to do, yet in this case it tends to be business telling government that they don't want to be open. That seems to be the argument.
Right. It is convenient for a number of businesses who just don't want to work on Sunday. And I don't know that there's any of us who don't appreciate that. When we're here at the Capitol on a Sunday, I am not a happy camper. But the reality of the year 2014 is that most retail businesses are open. And the reality in this situation, when we look at other comparables, is, not every restaurant is open 24/7, but some are. Not every hardware store is open 24/7, some are. If you know your clientele and you know your business, you can make the decisions that work best for you and your community and your clientele. And for some people, that is to be open on Sunday.
Let's talk a little bit about what your bill would do before we get into what you plan to do with it.
Yeah. So all the bill does is make it permissible. Right now, it's against state law for a liquor store to be open on a Sunday. And all this would say is you can. It doesn't say you have to be. For store owners that don't want to be open, don't. And for consumers who, for whatever reason, many of them religious, don't want to make a purchase on a Sunday, don't. There's nothing that would require that transaction to happen. But for stores that want to be open and for people who want to make a purchase, it would allow that to happen.
And it's fair to say this transcends just the typical liquor store now. We're talking about brew pubs and tap rooms, and many in the craft brew industry are now supporting you and abolishing this law. How does that kind of change the landscape of liquor versus legislators?
I think in 2014, there are really three things that are going on that make this a pretty viable year for this to happen. And it's kind of the first hurdle to overcome. This is a perennial issue, and it's easy to dismiss. And those who follow the legislature know that the House routinely does a floor amendment that fails terribly, and the press often refers to that as an indication of no support. But what we have going on this year is A, the unsession, and the governor's indication that he would sign a bill if it came to him. B, folks out there, just regular old folks, have really gotten organized. As a Commerce Committee member in the Senate, I now have received over 1,000 emails. I don't know that I've received that many emails on anything in my 5 years at the legislature. So people are engaged and they're contacting their elected officials. But three is the point you just brought up, and that is we now have this burgeoning, blossoming, growing exponentially microbrew industry in Minnesota, of which Duluth has become a real home for it. And those folks, especially on the brew pub side, even with the growler line of revenue for their businesses, cannot send someone home with a growler on a Sunday. It's currently against state law. And so many of them whose margins are fairly thin, especially in the startup phase, see this as an opportunity for them to bring some additional cash into their business.
And I would concur that there's even a fourth thing that has changed exponentially. You have a Republican who is authoring a comparable bill in the House.
Right.
Representative Jennifer Loon. She is the assistant minority leader, essentially. Now, her bill would just allow local governments to decide whether or not they're going to allow liquor sales. Would you allow for something like this if your bill isn't getting any support?
Absolutely. First of all, Jennifer and I are great friends. We served in the House together, was excited at her interest in this issue. And this idea of a local option is something that I've kicked around as well. In fact, Senator Paul Gazelka, who's the lead Republican in the Senate on the Commerce Committee, and I have had some conversation about it. If it makes sense in a border community, a college town, Minneapolis and St. Paul, and you can convince a city council or a county board, great. You know, there will be places in Minnesota where you have municipal liquor stores, or they're in the center of the state without any near competition, where it might not make sense. It might not fit the community. So I think that's a pretty viable option.
Now, Senator, as the person carrying this bill, do you think you need to do something differently this session to try to gain the support it needs to get passed off the Senate floor?
Well, I think there are things we can always do better. One of the things I am is just open to the other alternatives, like welcoming Representative Loon's approach. Really, though, I think what has changed is after the last session, I went to the advocates and said, you've got to engage, because right now in the halls of the Capitol, it's paid lobbyists who want to keep it the way it is versus empty space. And I can't be your only voice. I can't push this rock up a hill by myself. And they really have, and I think that has changed the dynamic. I know I've certainly gotten folks to publicly come out and say they want to be supportive, where it's been easier to sit on the fence or just be quiet about it in the past.
Okay, so what's next? Have you been talking with other lawmakers? Are you feeling like the momentum is shifting in your favor?
So 2 phases going on before session. One is to strategize with other supporters like Representative Loon and figure out what approach we want to take legislatively. And the other is, and I'm a big fan of process. I don't like blindsiding people or trying to, strong arm tactic anyone. So I've made calls to Senator Metzen in the Senate and also to Representative Atkins in the House, as well as to the minority leads, and to say, there's clearly something going on here. There's a lot of public pressure. This perfectly fits with an unsession. The governor says he'll sign the bill. Where can we move? Where are you willing to go with this? And that will really determine, I think, what the approach is when we convene on February 25th. But to be clear, I think there's more energy around this than there's ever been.
Okay, well, we will track it during session, of course. Senator Reinert, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
A new stadium could bring a new opportunity to shine the national spotlight on the state. Governor Mark Dayton led a news conference to announce Minnesota will seek becoming the host of a Super Bowl. The governor says it could secure the state great visibility and revenue.
The Super Bowl in Indianapolis a couple years ago brought $324 million to the city in that area, and we expect more than that in 2018 if we're successful, close to $500 million of money coming from visitors all over the country, all over the world to see the stadium and see Minnesota, and we'll have a chance to showcase Minnesota to the nation and to the world.
An issue that will likely surface in the 2014 legislative session is the balance of law enforcement using technology to monitor people, along with the individual's right to privacy. Here to talk about his proposal, we have Senator Branden Peterson. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Senator, the question is, what standards should be in place when law enforcement utilizes the most modern surveillance technology? So before I ask you what you think that answer should be, I want to ask you if you believe the tracking of individuals is out of control at this point.
Well, I think it is, and I think that the statutes that we have in place aren't up to speed with the technological capabilities that we have. 30 years ago, you would have never envisioned that the government could track your movement 24 hours a day using your cell phone, keep a log of every single person that you speak to on the phone. Even credit card transactions, which is separate from this issue, are now being collected as part of mass surveillance. And so I think that people are now revisiting the issue of privacy in light of those technological capabilities.
And so what do you think the answer to the question is?
Well, I think when you're talking about the issue of searching people's papers, if you will, as it's described in the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, I think a lot of people would also include the number of contacts that you are making, whereas that used to be something that law enforcement would have to request via a warrant or a subpoena of the phone company, is now something they can do without ever contacting a third party. And so I think that people, in particular, if they're individually being targeted by law enforcement, I think there should be a search warrant requirement, for example, in place.
The House Civil Law Committee just had a hearing on this issue, and Catherine Crump, an ACLU attorney, stated during her testimony that as you craft legislation, it's important to look ahead to technologies of tomorrow and just not what's available now. So what kind of challenges does this present as you move forward?
Well, I think the key is not enumerating a particular piece of technology. And so what we're thinking of doing is, rather than saying it's with the cellular exploitative device, which is, or kingfish as it's commonly referred to, is saying that any time that you specifically surveil an individual for purposes of an investigation, outside of an emergency situation where someone's life is at risk, that situation should require a search warrant. And so that way, if you lay out and enumerate the criteria, that would be surveillance of an individual for a specific crime, recording location, recording phone calls, that should require a search warrant. And so then it doesn't really matter what the kind of technology is, right? Whether it's kingfish or something down the road that is singling in an individual for ongoing surveillance, that should be sort of a timeless statute. It should apply in all situations regardless of what the capabilities are.
Where does the state really fit in with something like this?
Well, I mean, I think I try to control what I can control here, and as a state legislator, I'm primarily concerned about those things that are affecting Minnesotans and the people in my district. I think there's some merit to a federal statute or a federal conversation about this issue, and I think as more sunlight is shown on the NSA issue in particular, and mass surveillance issues all around, I think you'll see conversations at every level of government. We've even seen conversations at city and county government about other means of surveillance, be it drones or what have you.
Okay, Senator, I want to switch gears right now and look ahead to what has been called the Safe and Supportive Schools Act. You sit on the Senate Education Finance Committee.
Yeah.
You oppose this measure. Why?
Well, I think, first of all, I mean, let me just say everybody opposes bullying. And I believe, having served on both the Policy and the Finance Committee, that there is strong support for enhancing the state statute around bullying, both with Republicans and Democrats. I think the issue here is, as has been pointed out by the School Boards Association and others, is number one, it's a significant and costly mandate. Number two, it goes about a lengthy list of requirements, including volunteer training, language like real and perceived imbalances of power, and that has to be judged by administrators in schools. And so I think there's a lot of concern around exactly how that will be enforced and whether that will become sort of an arbitrary standard from district to district because of sort of the burden of all of those requirements around bullying. But everybody is opposed to bullying. It's just a matter of whether we can come to an agreement. And like I said, I'm confident that the Republican caucuses would support a bullying bill that would enhance the state language, but to this point, we haven't been able to get there.
So what would you like to see in a piece of legislation that you could support?
Well, I think right now the state statute is primarily just a directive to districts that says you need to have a policy about bullying. I think that we could update the statute as it relates to cyberbullying, for example. A lot of those issues were not contemplated when that original language was put into statute, and the idea now that some kids are tormented 24 hours a day using their mobile devices, I think is abhorrent and should be dealt with. And so I think that's one issue. I think that we can, rather than saying specifically, or not specifically that you need to have a set of policies, that we can enumerate some maybe harsher penalties for students at the district level. So I think there are, like I said, there is an appetite to do something around this issue, not only to bring the statute up to sort of where technology is today with cyberbullying, but also making sure that every district has sort of a minimum threshold of accountability for students and teachers.
If it's found that there is indeed a price tag for schools to try to implement this policy, a policy change, if there is one passed by the legislature, would you support increasing funding to help pay for that?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to point out that in the last biennium, there was an incremental $500 million dedicated to public education. So I would consider a safe environment a sort of core function of school districts, and so that should be part of what they're doing every day. So part of that $500 million should be going to that anyways. I'm sure that everybody agrees that making sure that kids aren't harassed and that they're not being picked on and that they're safe is a core function, and that it shouldn't necessarily be its own dedicated funding stream for that issue. And we do, as you probably know, already have what's called the Safe Schools Levy in each district that allows districts to raise revenue just for that sort of issue.
Okay, Senator Peterson, we are out of time. Thank you for talking about both of these issues with us, so we certainly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
One of the more controversial bills last session was the Safe and Supportive Schools Act, also known as the Anti-Bullying Bill. Before we sit down with Senate author Scott Dibble to discuss his bill and its future in 2014, John Brune examines what happened with it in 2013.
I bring this bill to you because we've waited so long to really meaningfully address bullying that occurs in our schools across the state. We know from a survey...
The Safe and Supportive Minnesota Schools Act, a name given to state anti-bullying legislation, was debated at the Capitol in 2013, but failed to gain final legislative approval. It is one of a number of proposed bills expected back in 2014. Current Minnesota law sets a basic requirement that all school districts must have an anti-bullying policy. The law does not specifically state what that policy should be or how bullying should be defined.
A lot of people have, I guess, take issue with the current law that it doesn't tell people enough, that the districts don't really know what to do. Even though if they have a policy, they may not know how to respond or consider certain incidents as bullying.
Right now, Madam President, we have what is widely recognized to be the weakest anti-bullying effort in our state statutes, completely lacking in any meaningful direction to folks who are working on this issue at 37 words. And it significantly lacks some important provisions.
The anti-bullying bill that lawmakers debated in 2013 was much more detailed than the current law.
The proposed legislation has elements of training for volunteers, staff, and students, which is not a part of the current law, because the current law just tells you you have a policy. It doesn't tell you, again, the components of that policy. And the proposed law also has items about when to start your investigation and what are some appropriate responses by the school to incidents of bullying and how to stop it from happening again.
Senate committee testimony reflected troubling personal experiences, as well as varying concerns about the proposed legislation.
When I was 7 years old and in second grade, I was the victim of ongoing and repeated bullying at the elementary school I then attended. The bullying was done by two students that were in the same class as me. The bullying that happened to me included physical harm, verbal threats, intimidation, and stealing.
The locker rooms in middle school were hell for me. I was constantly threatened and called faggot by the boys in my grade, and my gym teachers ignored any attempts I made to explain to them why I was uncomfortable changing in a room full of boys who were making my life hell. The bullying got so bad that in middle school, I seriously considered taking my life numerous times, and between 7th and 8th grade had a failed suicide attempt.
I agree that we need a new law in place to address the very real problem of student-to-student bullying, but I believe that as it's currently drafted, there are some concerns that make it difficult for an administrator to implement. Bullying can come up in a lot of different forms. Physical abuse can be bullying, verbal abuse can be bullying, ostracism can be bullying. Bullying can come up in a lot of ways. And so I believe it was drafted broadly with the very good intention of not leaving anything out. My concern is that it also sweeps in a lot of behavior that is not necessarily bullying.
Session floor debate included concerns that the bill amounted to an unfunded mandate and arguments that it had too many regulations and directives for school districts.
This amendment says that if we are going to impose this as an unfunded mandate, the schools don't need to comply. So that if the state wants to impose this on the school districts, then we simply should fund it.
I spoke with my superintendents of very large districts, Minnetonka, West Tonka, Orono, Wayzata, Delano, Rockford. We had them all in the same room. All of them said no. They're already doing this. They already have the resources. They already have their plans in place. They do not need this additional intrusion. Their school boards are supportive of them. They have good programs in place. This is unnecessary legislation.
I want to recognize that many schools are doing great work, and many schools and many students and teachers and parents are trying really, really hard. But oftentimes they feel hampered by a lack of support, a lack of clear direction, a lack of resources, and a lack of knowledge.
Minnesota's current anti-bullying law was adopted in 2005 and amended to include cyberbullying in 2007.
What exactly your bill would require school districts to do?
Well, the bill itself is fairly simple in its conception and its construction. Probably the most important thing is that schools would be required to adopt effective, comprehensive anti-bullying policies and communicate those clearly to the students, to teachers, to school administration, and of course to the community and to parents. And it would make sure that procedures and processes were in place to respond in a timely fashion to reports of bullying, make it clear what bullying is, make sure that all kids are protected within those policies, particularly those kids who receive a disproportionate amount of bullying on the basis of prejudice and the like. And then it would make available to schools training so that schools could really engage in best practices, so that the adults who are responsible for making sure that bullying is responded to can respond effectively. Then also make available to schools on a voluntary basis some guidance and some help and some technical assistance in doing the kind of work that we really are trying to accomplish, which is prevention, so that bullying doesn't really recedes as a major issue in schools, because we know for a fact from all the research, all the evidence, all the work that we've done over the past few years that bullying is a real issue. It has real consequence in kids' lives. It's very harmful. Not just the kids who are the targets of bullying, but all kids who are a part of a climate in which bullying is allowed to occur. And something can be done about it. We can prevent bullying.
And even opponents of your legislation concur with the thought that Minnesota has one of the weakest anti-bullying pieces of legislation currently. Right. So the levels of support really vary, and even the executive director of the Minnesota School Board Association said members of his group would support efforts to prevent bullying, but simply they, quote, want a better bill. What to these people who aren't completely on board, what constitutes a better bill?
Well, they'll have to speak for themselves. The Minnesota School Boards Association has asked for a number of changes in the legislation, and we've accommodated every single one of their changes. So in this interim year, they've gone back to think of more things to change in the bill. I have to be honest, Julie, I don't think the School Boards Association has been at the table in good faith. They resisted and tried to defeat the bill in previous years, and they have been resistant to receiving any direction.
Why so? Why do you think that's the case?
I think it's a standard response that they give to any sort of policy change that comes from the legislature. They don't like to be told what to do. The thing to pay attention to in the bill, though, is we provide for a tremendous amount of local initiative and local control. We don't mandate forms of discipline. We don't mandate any sort of staffing ratios. We don't mandate the expenditure of a lot of money. Schools are already spending a lot of money, and they probably will end up spending a lot less money if they do this anti-bullying work and this bullying response work effectively. But if you ask anyone who's on the education committee, anyone who works in education issues, School Boards Association resists any initiatives that come out of the legislature, just as a knee-jerk matter of course reaction.
And you're using the word mandate. It's something that the opponents use quite heavily as well. And you've stated in committee that this is not a mandate. It's encouraging schools to develop a program and curriculum that addresses the overachieving issue of climate so bullying can be addressed. Right. So, but isn't this essentially an unfunded mandate to the tune of $39 million? That's what the opponents cite.
Right, right. That's false, utterly false. There was a very, very poorly constructed, what they call local impact note that they went back and revised significantly and brought down the estimated cost significantly. But keep in mind, we provided significant revenue for schools to address this issue. Some of that revenue will be just kind of a one-time effort of establishing these policies and communicating them effectively to the whole school community, one-time expenditure. And we provided an additional $450 million to schools
this last year. Plus, we provided the opportunity for local levies to be used for school safety and school security matters. So there is no unfunded mandate. There's already money being spent in this arena as well. A lot of it's going to be one time. And over time, costs are going to come down quite significantly. Students are going to be achieving much better academically. Schools are going to be safer. There's going to be far less exposure to legal liability for failure to protect kids.
And just a refresher for our viewers, this bill did make it through the process last session. It didn't make it to the floor. There was some question on whether or not it would on that final day of session.
Well, it did get taken up on the floor, just didn't receive its final vote.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification. So what's next? What are you going to do with this in 2014?
So it'll just simply go back to the last committee in which it appeared, which is the Finance Committee. And we'll have kind of another kind of final hearing, get it back to the floor of the Senate, maybe make some changes to the extent that the School Boards Association has brought up some additional issues that we can tweak and nudge. Now keep in mind, we've already changed probably a dozen or more provisions in the bill to accommodate the school boards, and the school associations even testified in committee that we had accommodated every single concern of theirs. They've got some new ones, that's fine. We'll take a look at which ones are legitimate and change those things that we need to. Make those changes in committee, get it back to the floor, vote it in at the floor, send it to the House, where hopefully it'll be in sufficient form that the House can accept it. They'll take their final vote and it'll go to the governor.
Senator, my last question for you is it more important to you to get something passed that strengthens what we currently have, even if it's not as strong as what's currently in place?
Well, I think already we have a bill in which a lot of really important provisions were dropped because they actually do represent some expense, or we need some more conversation. Issues around teacher licensure and teacher training, for example. That gets us into a whole different conversation around higher ed issues and teacher licensure. Some work around social emotional curriculum. That's a lot of work that takes a lot of time and needs a lot of buy-in and that sort of thing. So there are a number of recommendations that came out of the governor's task force on the prevention of bullying that we just didn't pursue. So we have a bill, I think, that represents a really, really good compromise, provides for local control and prevention ultimately, which is what we're after.
Okay, Senator Scott Dibble, as always, thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Julie.
This news conference brought Republicans and Democrats together as they announced two pieces of legislation that would tighten domestic violence laws.
Janae came to my office frightened. She told me her story. Years ago, when she was pregnant with her child, her intimate partner strangled and assaulted her. He was convicted of domestic assault by strangulation and was incarcerated. Even as he was behind bars, Janae still didn't feel safe. She feared he would find her when he got out. So she moved to a different part of Minnesota, seeking safety, looking for a fresh start. As his release date approached, she was nervous about where in Minnesota he would be released. Even though she had relocated her entire life, she worried. Would he be released 5 minutes or 5 hours away? Would he find her? Would he hurt her and the children again? Janae knew approximately when he would be released from prison, but the law said she couldn't know where he would be released when he got out.
And that concludes this week's program. From all of us at Senate Media Services, I'm Julie Bartkey. Thank you for watching Capitol Report.